Okay, here is a video I put together on how I make sourdough. I started by taking out my starter. You can take it out 24 hours before, you can leave it out a week before. Just remember, if you leave it out, you have to feed it. I like to feed it before I use it. Sometimes I like to feed it a little bit before. Sometimes I feed it far in advance, like 24 hours in advance. It really just depends on if I'm feeling experimental and want to see like what kind of flavor I can get. Depending on the time before that you feed it, it can be more sour, less sour, have a bigger rise. You never really know, so it's fun to experiment sometimes. So I'm just doing half a cup of bread flour. I always use bread flour to feed it. And then half a cup of filtered water. I have a Berkey water filter that I use. And if you hear some noises in the background, I'm just making lunch for myself. I'll try not to be too obnoxious with it, but no promises. Yeah, so I pour in the water and the flour, and then I like to use a chopstick to just stir it up. Make sure it's mostly uniform. There will probably be some chunks, but I haven't had any issues with that. It's just kind of chunky sometimes, and the chunks will like be absorbed and settle down as it rests. So I'm really just getting in there, and I like to scrape the sides down. So you'll see me cleaning off the chopstick there, making sure there's no like huge lumps attached to the chopstick, and they're not. So I'm gonna go wash my chopstick, wash my hands, and I think one of the fun parts about making sourdough is that you can kind of experiment however you want. I like to put a paper towel as a barrier and don't latch my jar all the way so that air and gas can escape. And now I'm getting my digital scale. I'm just gonna put it down on the counter, and I'm gonna get 2 bowls. Sometimes I just use one. But if you can see my scale's not very big, so if I use a huge bowl on the scale, I can't always see the numbers. So there's my smaller bowl that I put on the scale, and then my bigger bowl that I put all of the ingredients in after I measure them. And here's me trying to not be silly, and I like to keep this scale in grams, but however you like to measure is up to you. And then I like to sift my flour, so I have like an actual sifter, I just have that. So I'll put that in my bowl, and it is 500 grams of bread flour. There's me being a brat. 500 grams of bread flour. I've sped up some parts of the video so it's not like monotonous to watch. Getting exactly 500. You don't actually have to get exactly 500. Like I said, I'm just a brat. And then I'll sift the flour in and make sure there's no clumps or anything weird. Sometimes flour can have larger clumps in it that aren't supposed to be there. That's okay, just throw it out. And now I'm gonna do 10 grams of salt. You can use basically any type of salt you want. If you want to use flavored salt, you can. If you want to use table salt. I haven't had any issues with like salt being weird. There's me also being a brat trying to get exactly 10 grams. Not necessary. If you have 11 grams, it's okay. If you have 9 grams, it's okay. I have had my bread be not salty enough, and it's not necessarily not salty enough in that it tastes sweet, but you can tell it's just kind of bland. And then here I'm going to do 25 grams of olive oil. And now, so the flour and the salt were the only 2 dry ingredients, and now we're just doing all the wet ingredients, so I'm just going to leave it all in the bowl while I measure it. So 25 grams of olive oil, and I'm going to get 250 grams of filtered water. And here I thought I definitely had enough water in my cup, and I didn't. So I'm running back to my Berkey to get more water to get to 150. And there, 250 grams of water. I always use filtered water. I don't trust the water here. And 125 grams of sourdough starter that's active and bubbly. And it doesn't necessarily have to be room temperature. It can be cold still. It can be kind of runny sometimes. It can be kind of chunky, and that's still okay. And so I said 125 grams. I used my half of a cup measuring cup to see how many grams that was, and if I scraped all the sides and got all of it out, it equaled 125 grams. Depending on the consistency of your starter, it could be different for you, but mine is pretty watery. Some people have a very light and bubbly starter. Couldn't be me. But I just recommend using a scale, but if you don't have one, half a cup is probably a safe bet. And now I'm just mixing up all those wet ingredients together. This isn't really necessary. I just like to do it this way. And because sometimes the starter will sink to the bottom. So I just like to make sure I get it all. And I just pour in the wet ingredients on top of the dry ingredients. And I do it slowly to make sure I have all of it coming out of the bowl and nothing sticking to the bottom. I don't know why I like using a chopstick for this, but I feel like it's easy to clean, and it helps to mix things pretty evenly when you're just getting your rough mix first. So that's what it looks like. And then like I said, I just mix it together with my little chopstick until it's like a rough shaggy dough. That's what I mean. You can kind of see like some parts of flour are still there, some of it's wet, but it's mostly incorporated. And then in the bowl, I'll kind of scrape down the sides and just not necessarily knead, but mix so it's a little bit more incorporated. You can also use a standing mixer or a bread mixer, that's fine. I don't have those things, so I just use my hands. And now I like to get, once it's like mostly incorporated like that, I like to get a silicone baking mat. You can use just a wooden block, you can use just your countertop, as long as it's clean. It doesn't really matter, it's your preference. And I'll take all the contents of the bowl and put them on the mat. So I like to have a larger workspace because it can get kind of messy. And I like to scrape down the sides, just at least a little bit. So here you'll see me doing that with a spoon. It gets all the ingredients, but also it makes the bowl easier to clean. I'm going to use that same bowl throughout the whole process. So I'm just scraping out all the dry ingredients. I'll put it on top of the dough. You don't have to do that, but you can. If you don't want those little shaggy parts, that's fine. And now I'll knead just a little bit. Try not to knock everything off of your workspace like I did right there. Oopsies. And I'll incorporate the little shaggy parts. Like I said, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can just start mixing, and whatever parts don't incorporate on their own, you can just toss them or throw them on the floor, whatever. Yeah, it doesn't have to be 100% totally incorporated either. You don't really have to knead that much. And again, you can use a standing mixer with a bread hook and just kind of go for 2 to 5 minutes on a medium setting if you have a standing mixer. So I'm just going around trying to pick up all the little extra pieces, because at this point the dough gets kind of sticky with the wet ingredients. If you don't like how sticky it feels, you can spray your hands with water, but it's supposed to be pretty sticky. You can see I'm demonstrating like how it looks and feels when you pull your hand away from it. That's about how sticky it should be. And there I cleaned the bowl. I'm gonna put the dough back in the bowl, and I'm going to let it sit for an hour. It's called, I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think it's Autolyse or Autolyse. You just want to let it sit and let the gluten kind of form all together, let it all absorb. And then now we're going to move into our 3-hour stretching and folding period. And I know what you're thinking, 3 hours, oh my gosh. It doesn't actually have to be 3 hours. I just stretch and fold 6 times, sorry, not 3 times, over the course of the 3 hours. And so like I said before, the dough isn't necessarily all the way incorporated yet. There's still some clumps, that's okay. The stretching and folding and rising will take care of this. So I stretched the dough out, not so much that it tore anywhere, and now I'm just rolling it up one way and then stretching it a little bit more and then rolling it up the other way. So it kind of looks like a little croissant. You don't have to do it that way. There's tons of different ways you can stretch and fold. Some people will, take the dough ball, pull it from the middle and literally just stretch up. And some people will flatten it and roll it up like I did. Some people will press down and then form it into a dough ball. And it's kind of just whatever feels best for you. I'm going to cover my dough so it doesn't really get dried out. I decided to rearrange my kitchen while I was doing this. I think it was a success, but yeah. I usually set a timer for 30 minutes and do it every 30 minutes. But if I'm pressed for time, sometimes I'll do 15 minutes. And this is my bulk rise period. I started bulk rising at 1:30 p.m. and I finished my rise at 10:30 p.m. It doesn't have to actually double in size, but you want to see some fermentation bubbles, and you want it to be smooth, and you want it to have risen a little bit. So now after it rose, I'm just kind of gently scraping it out of the bowl to try to get all the little pieces out. And I'm putting it on my workspace again. And now is when I'm going to shape it the first time. So first I'm going to gently press down, and you don't want to, like some dough recipes will be like, punch the bread down. You don't necessarily have to punch it down. You can just gently degas it like I did. I'm going to take all the outer edges, fold them in towards me, or not towards me, towards the center of the dough. But I suppose you could just do it towards yourself. Doesn't really matter that much. And then I'm going to put my hand around the outer edges and pull in slightly, about an inch, all the way around until it forms like a nice round dough ball. And then I'm going to cover it again and let it sit for anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. I like to do longer. Some people will just do 15 minutes. It really kind of just depends on how much time you have available. My husband came home while it was waiting an hour. And I'm going to do that whole thing again. I'm just going to press down gently and fold in towards the center of the dough. And you don't necessarily have to flip it around. I just like the seam side to be on the bottom. So it looks smooth on top, but it doesn't really matter too much, honestly. And there, I shaped it up. And you can shape it in any kind of shape you like. Some people like to do an oval instead of like a round shape. Some people will let it sit in these little wooden or bamboo balls or bowls. There's so many different words that they use. This is me being a brat again. And what I mean by words that they use, like they'll call it a boule, the shape of the dough, instead of a ball, but you don't need to get into all of that. There's no need to overcomplicate it. And make sure you preheat your oven to 450 degrees. And while I'm waiting for my oven to preheat, I like to prepare my dough like this. I like to sprinkle a little flour on top. My oven was already preheated because I was cooking a lasagna. I like to spread the flour around, and now don't make the slit in the dough until right before you're about to cook it. I use this. It's an actual just razor blade. They call it a bread lame. I ordered it on Amazon. You can use a sharp knife. Just make sure that when you do the slit, you do it fast and don't have to press down super hard. I find it easier if I'm using a knife and not my lame. I like to use a serrated knife because I find that those have sharper edges that help get in there. But like I said, it's important that you don't do the slit until right before you're about to put it in the oven. So you've preheated your oven to 450 degrees. You're going to put your bread in your cooking vessel. You want it to have a lid to keep the steam in, but I have seen people use like a baking plate or a stone and then put something else on top of it, over it, rather than a bowl with a lid. And right before you put your bread in the oven, you want to change the temperature to 400 degrees and set the timer for 20 minutes. And when the 20-minute timer is up, you're going to take the lid off, or the cover off. There's my lasagna. It was delicious. And you're going to take the lid off, and it looks about like that after 20 minutes. And now you're going to let the bread cook uncovered. I usually do 40 minutes longer. And some people like to go longer. Some people like it very dark. I just like that nice golden brown color. So once that's done, you're going to pull it out. I like to immediately take it out of the cooking pot or off of the stone, whatever you're going to use. Some people get a nice ear, they call it, and that's like where you do the slit where it lifts up away from the bread. I don't really try that hard to get that, so this is kind of just what my bread looks like. The bottom looks a little silly. I probably just didn't let it sit or settle long enough before I put it in the oven. That's okay. Didn't really change the flavor or the texture at all. Now let your bread sit for at least 3 hours before you cut into it, or it'll turn gummy. But I waited overnight because at that point it was like midnight when I was done cooking. And that's kind of what the inside looks like. I'm happy with that crumb. And now you can just cut it open and enjoy your bread.